Great books can take you anywhere, even into outer space. This is my top 14 science fiction novels of all time list. But before we get started, remember to go into the description and click on that link for a free fantasy ebook. And remember to follow this channel because that's really going to help me out and you can get way more great content coming up, all right? So let's do it. Welcome back to Great Stories Change the World. This is the YouTube channel where fantasy science fiction author, that's me, goes over books and movies and TV shows and studies why are these great stories? Why do we love them so much? Or maybe they're not great stories. Because I believe if you're going to tell a story, you should tell it well. And that's what this channel is all about, helping us to tell better stories because I believe great stories do change things. They change people, they change societies, they change all sorts of things. So today we're going to be talking about science fiction, and science fiction novels from day one have been used to make some sort of insight about human nature. And you would think, oh, it's about the future and it's all about imagination and rocket ships, and there's a lot of space opera adventure that people associate nowadays with science fiction because of Star Trek and that sort of thing. But really, at its core, science fiction is like fantasy. The kind of the strict beginnings of science fiction was all about kind of showing us who we are. It's kind of putting a mirror up in front of us, but doing it in a very symbolic way with aliens and all sorts of different fantastical places and new technologies and all sorts of things, and asking questions. If we could time travel, what would that be like? And for me, science fiction was my first love. When I was a kid, Star Wars came out. And so for me, it was one of my first things that I tried to read and tried to watch. I mean, I did Star Trek, the original series. This is before The Next Generation came out. I went to see those movies. So science fiction is kind of my first love as an author. I got way more into fantasy in my teens and in my 20s, especially with Lord of the Rings, but with all sorts of things, Brandon Sanderson. But I really got into a lot of Star Trek, Star Wars, a lot of the classic science fiction like The Time Machine. And so we're going to go over some of these books because I really believe a lot of these classics and some of these newer books are well worth your time to go check out if you haven't read them yet, okay? So let's get to it. Right, beginning with number 14, we have the Space Trilogy by Timothy Zahn. Now, for those of you who don't know, this was a huge deal in the early 90s. This came out in 1991. And there were other books in sort of an expanded universe. There were comic books with Marvel. So there was some of this expanded universe of Star Wars that had happened, and there were toys. And, Lucas was a genius with all of this sort of stuff. But, after Return of the Jedi, people were wondering, what's next? I mean, there's got to be more story, right? Does Luke start more Jedi? Does he start a Jedi Academy? What sort of stuff is going to happen later after, these main three movies? And, the stars were young enough still, and it was going to make money. So a lot of people were really sort of kind of hounding George Lucas. But what Lucas ended up doing was making a lot of books. So the stars, especially, probably Carrie Fisher and Harrison Ford, they didn't really want to come back to this universe. And so he wanted the stories to continue, but he put them in a novelization form. And the first sort of big bang with that was the Thrawn trilogy. And Timothy Zahn does an amazing job translating the Star Wars universe into novel form, creating a new character and a great villain in Admiral Thrawn. And we're going to see him in The Mandalorian maybe, but definitely in the Ahsoka series on Star Wars. He was in Star Wars Rebels. But here's where we get kind of the inception of that bad guy, and he's a great villain. And you get the introduction of Mara Jade, and you get the introduction of all these other sort of things within this universe that he's able to weave in the different storylines. And he really came out with a great trilogy. It's still a good read, and it's more action adventure, but it definitely has that Star Wars feel to it. It has that Star Wars sort of arcs to it with the different things. And so he did a really great job with all of that, which is why you see a lot of his characters, especially Thrawn, have even survived into other properties and even into the new canon, as it were, even though a lot of those books through the 90s and the early 2000s were kind of shuffled off as legacy sort of stuff. But this is a great trilogy. The first one was Heir to the Empire. There was Dark Force Rising, and then The Last Command. Those are the 3 books, and he just put them out, boom, 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 and they're great reads. So check those out. Number 13, we have the Space Trilogy by C.S. Lewis. Now, again, I'm putting some of these all together, but really you might want to just start with the first book and see if you like it. But with the Space Trilogy and C.S. Lewis, this came out in 1938. So World War II was just kind of getting started. This was still in the Depression, and there were all sorts of philosophies, and communism was sort of taking ground in a lot of ways. Even in the West, there people were discussing, like, how can we help people? And maybe this is a failure of capitalism and all of this sort of stuff. And so in the midst of all that, C.S. Lewis, who was kind of a Christian apologist, and he had kind of started some of the Narnia stuff. He was more famous for Narnia because it was for kids and it was really, really good, right? If you check out my other video on fantasy novels, but the Space Trilogy was really influenced by H.G. Wells and a lot of those sort of the classic science fiction authors and writers. And he even just admits it in like the foreword or something of the first book, Out of the Silent Planet. And basically it's Mars, it goes by a different name, and there's a professor, shockingly, there's this professor, linguistics professor, I think, and he goes to Mars, although it's by a different sort of name, and then there's all these sort of celestial things that are happening, and has to get a lot of things explained to him, and there's different races and beings, and it's interesting. It's way more philosophical than it is action adventure, or some of the other sort of things that he did, especially with Narnia. But it's very interesting, and it's very influential, and again, I dig it. So check that out. C.S. Lewis is great. Number 12, we have Princess of Mars. This is by Edgar Rice Burroughs. Now, we know him from Tarzan. Tarzan was his big property, and that's where he really made all of his money, and they made a lot of movies and TV shows, and I probably watched a billion different Tarzan movies when I was a kid because they would come on Saturday afternoons, right? So Tarzan was his big sort of adventure, fantasy sort of thing. But in the sci-fi realm, he did The Princess of Mars, and there's a whole kind of series with that. There's a guy, John Carter, I think his name was, which is where they made the movie, John Carter, a few years ago, which was okay. But it's based on this series where he's kind of like an ex-Confederate guy, I think, and it's kind of a Western in the beginning, but then he's kind of portaled into this other realm, and he realizes later it's Mars again. Mars keeps coming up, and so he realizes it's Mars, but there's all these different kingdoms and creatures, and it's a little more fantastical when it gets there, but it's science fiction in that there are different technologies and stuff. So this is Princess on Mars, and it's really fun. It's not great writing in the sense of like it's really going to make you think philosophically. I know I kind of said that in the beginning, but this isn't as much of a philosophical sort of writing, or what are humans really about, or who's the real monster sort of thing. This is way more action adventure, but really fun. This is some of the beginnings of pulp fiction. I don't know if you know that term, but just for fun, just fiction for fun. So that's number 12, Princess of Mars. Check that out. That came out in 1912, by the way. And number 11, in 1950, I, Robot came out. And this was by a classic, one of the main guys with science fiction, Isaac Asimov. And originally, these were a series of short stories that kind of appeared in some science fiction magazines. And they had some similar characters, and one main character kind of runs through it, and so he kind of put all of these in a book. They were popular stories, so he said, well, let's put some of these stories in a book, make a book out of it. And this is really one of his more popular books. You've got the three laws of the robots, and you've got a real good world building with the robots and where they come from, and they're not allowed to hurt a human. They have to do what a human says unless it's going to hurt another human. And so there's these sort of laws that they have to abide by. The robots do. But again, this is one of those more philosophical, properties and worlds that science fiction has, where here are robots and they have personalities, but are they really not? They're not human, obviously, but how sentient are they? How alive are they? What does it mean to be alive? What does it mean to be a person? All of those sort of things. You get some of those questions in there, along with a lot of the cool science fiction technological stuff. So classic 1950 iRobot. Now, another classic, which is definitely along the same vein with iRobot, is 1968's Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? This is by Philip K. Dick, and he is another famous author. We get Minority Report. We get all sorts of different movies that have been made, adapted from his sort of books and stories and short stories. This was more of a novel, and this is where we get Blade Runner. So Blade Runner wasn't made until the early 80s, and Ridley Scott, and it was a great movie, but the term Blade Runner doesn't really appear in the actual book, but there is Deckard is a bounty hunter of these androids who look human and they can act human and all of these sort of things. And if they go rogue, he's got to hunt them down and kill them. And so, you do have these sort of same questions, like, are they really alive, right? That's all kind of the title, right? Do androids dream of electric sheep? Like these are machines of a sort, but they're also very lifelike, and they seem to have feelings, and they have desires, and if they can rebel, are they really just machines, and all of this sort of stuff. So, and we're really getting into some of these things in a kind of a weird way with a lot of the AI, like how a lot of things that AI is able to do nowadays can kind of mimic some personality and mimic some things. And so we're starting to see some really weird crossover with some of these. But Philip K. Dick is amazing. This is a great book, but it's not the movie. So the movie is very different. The movie has a little bit more action, and depending on which version of the movie you see, it's got a little bit better resolution at the end. But it is a good book, and I highly recommend reading it. Number 9 is Old Man's War. This came out in 2006, so this is one of the more recent ones, and this is another one of my favorite authors, John Scalzi. Now, Old Man's War deals with this guy. His name was John Perry, and he was like in marketing or something, and he got to a certain age and retired, and his wife died. And the Federation, the Earth Federation, has this sort of deal where they can make you young again. And if you go into the army, and they'll shoot you off into space to fight aliens, and you can never come back, right? You basically give up on your life and say goodbye to everything and everybody. But since his wife died, he just really didn't feel like there was anything left for him. So he's kind of given whatever the process is, and he's made young again, and they go off into space. And then there's there's battles, and then there's sort of his sort of personal struggles about what it means now to how immortal is he in that sort of sense, and the risks that he can take, and the friends that he makes, and the characters. It is a great book. The other books in the series to me aren't as good. This one is an amazing book. Old Man's War, one of the best, 2006. And it's just got a cool setup, and it's got a cool character and some other characters that he has to deal with, because there's all sorts of different moral issues about if my life is over, does it matter what I do and what's right and wrong? And so it's really a cool book. And John Scalzi has one of my favorite books too called Red Shirts, which didn't make this list, but at the same time, if you ever get a chance to read Red Shirts, highly recommend it. It's funny. It's funny. It's just kind of a Star Trek takeoff, but it's very funny. The last one, number 8, right? The last one for this video, number 8, we have Brave New World. This was in 1932, and it was kind of put out again in 1934. And this was basically kind of a futuristic, nihilistic, not a doomsday thing, but a very skeptical view of if we keep going in this direction. This is Aldous Huxley was the author's name, and he's kind of making his own sort of aspersions upon culture, saying, look, if we keep going in this direction, then what's going to happen is it's going to become very meaningless. We're going to have a meaningless life in a lot of ways. People are being drugged, and sex doesn't matter, and people don't have to commit to each other, and there's all these sort of consequences if we keep going down this path and keep going down this slope, right? And this was in 1932, and so this is again right at the beginning of the Depression, and again, you can see why he might have sort of a dark view of the future of humanity. But there's this character who his name is John, and he's in this village, and so he's been kind of outside of this somewhat utopian, futuristic world. He's been raised by natives, and he's called the savage, and so he goes to he's brought in to experience this brave new world. And of course, he knows nothing but Shakespeare and self-survival and all this stuff. So he's kind of the extreme. And that's good writing, right? Good writing is taking these extremes and putting them together and then seeing what happens and showing the conflict, showing the questions that come up. And so Brave New World is a classic. I don't know that there's a great movie that's been made of it, but I really think they could make a great movie out of this one. Anyway, and the ending is very interesting of the book, and I think it would make a great movie. So these are my bottom 7. So this is 14 through 8 of my top 14 science fiction novel list. All right. You let me know what you think of this list. You let me know maybe some books that I don't have yet that you're like, you better have this in your top 7. All right. But check some of these books out if you haven't read them. I think they're great. I think you'll really enjoy them and make you ask a lot of questions, or maybe they'll just entertain you like Princess of Mars will. But check these out, and we will see you next time on Great Stories Change the World. Remember.